Have you wondered what financial advisors actually think about finances? This is your sneak peek at the conversations within Financial Design Studio. Michelle Smollenberger, the CEO here, will be your host as you go behind the designs.
Welcome back to Behind the Designs. This podcast is all about giving you a better glimpse behind the scenes of financial plans just like yours. My name is Anna Lewis, and today I'm the guest host of this episode. And that's because we want to dive into estate planning, and Michelle Smollenberger is actually the one on our team who handles this area of planning. So welcome back to the mic as a guest, Michelle.
Thank you. It's kind of fun being on this side.
Today, we want to answer the question, what does the inheritance process actually look like? This is a great episode for those who are, like I said, creating estate plans, or for those who are anticipating receiving one in the future. Finances have the unfortunate effect of tearing relationships apart, and that's the last thing that we think an inheritance should do to a family. So, we're going to cover the different roles and stages of the inheritance process so that you know what to keep in mind so that you can protect your relationships. Let's talk about the different roles involved in the inheritance process.
Yeah, so this is always a great place to start. A lot of times, even when people are thinking about creating their estate planning documents, one of the things is we'll give them a list of here's kind of the people that you'll need to choose. So this can even be a sticky part for people when they're trying to choose who, or when they're trying to think of who should do this. Sometimes too, because you don't want to hurt feelings of people. So the biggest thing that you want to keep in mind is that you are choosing who is going to act, and you're choosing someone to act in. We're going to talk about the different ways that people would need to act, but you're actually wanting someone who can take action, who can handle paperwork, who can actually handle these things for you when you can't. So that's really what you're ultimately choosing here. So let's talk first about just a beneficiary, just that role of a beneficiary. So this is just simply someone who is inheriting money. You've been named as on an account as a person. If there's money left over when this person passes away, then you are going to receive something or a percentage of something. So a beneficiary is just the person who will receive money or assets. It could be a hard asset like a house or something like that when you pass away. And so that's what you're deciding is who should inherit those. Mm-hmm. Commonly that is parents, kids. So it's commonly those really first layer relationships, those primary ones. And then from there, if you don't have parents who are still living or kids, things like that, then you can start to think of other family members. Mm-hmm. So that's very common. And then there's people who, don't have any of those. And so they might choose organizations or even friends. So it can be anyone, but that's up to you. So that's beneficiary. You're simply named in a position to receive something. You can ask questions. So let's say that you are going to receive an inheritance, or you now have been made aware that you're receiving something. You can ask questions like, what type of account is it? Or how much is it? Usually they should tell you that. But one thing that I do find is sometimes when people know that they're a beneficiary, I think it can bring on kind of this mindset of entitlement and I'm expecting something. And I actually, when we work with clients a lot, they might think, I might inherit something someday. But for the most part, most people say, I don't want my plan to depend on that. I'm not counting on that. That's not my money. But I do sometimes see people who, maybe have a different perspective and kind of feel entitled to something. Mm-hmm. So I think that as a beneficiary can be tricky because you kind of need to manage those emotions, expectations, because those are someone's assets that they're giving to you if there's something left. And so it's really just, wow, that's, was unexpected, or, I wasn't entitled to it, or I'm not like, that's mine. So as a beneficiary, it's not yours, but you might inherit something.
Being thankful and not being like, that's mine, I deserve it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I think it's good for people to just think through those things. I think one question is, sometimes you don't know if you're a beneficiary on an account. Sometimes people will tell you, and really that's just up to the person who's choosing the beneficiaries. That's up to them to decide if they want to tell you or if they kind of want it to be a surprise, and not necessarily a surprise for wow, they had more than I thought. It's more of I don't know if there's going to be anything left. So I don't want to have you having this expectation that there's going to be something. So it might even be for reasons like that. So that's, you need to list it on an account, but you don't have to tell people. But it's probably good to tell people, maybe, for example, if you have 4 kids and they're 25% each beneficiary, I think it's a good idea just to say, this is how we generally have things structured. Again, you don't have to say amounts, but maybe that, just because then they know when something happens to you, someone knows, that they know, okay, well, I need to, like, maybe there was something there. It's kind of just gives them a chance to follow up on something just in case they aren't made aware of it.
Yeah. And I know that's one of the things that when we structure out client blueprints, we have those things listed so that people can see the big picture, so that they can see and understand just where everything is and where everything's going.
Yeah. And this is beneficiaries. It just, we're spending like a little bit of time on this, but it's actually kind of funny because a lot of times when you open an account, if you think about the times that you start an account, it's when you start a job. So you might have started a job 20 years ago and you name the beneficiary when you first set up your 401k, and you might not have been married at the time and you didn't have any kids because it was just your first job out of college. So you just list your mom, your dad, your siblings, whoever. But you don't think, well, okay, 20 years later, life has changed. Now I need to make sure I put my spouse on there and my kids. So it's really important just to check those. We at least say every 2 to 4 years, if life is changing a lot, you need to be sure that you're checking that. And a lot of times, like, that's why we want to put that information there, because it also doesn't get shown on a statement. So the things that you're receiving regularly in the mail from that account don't show who those beneficiaries are. Now, some companies do, and it might show the first one, but it doesn't show all of them. So that's why it's just one of those easily forgotten, easily not checked things. But if you pass away and no one's named, then your state has a plan. So if you didn't set a plan, your state has a plan for you, and whoever they say will be the beneficiary. So it's just really important. That's why these are kind of some easy little things, but it's really important. So that's the role of the beneficiary, but also just some important things to remember and check.
Yeah, because you want to make sure your money's going where you want it to go.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's kind of why I guess these next roles are really important, because like you said, you want your money to go where you want it to go. So a beneficiary choosing who's going to receive that is an important piece of that, making sure you've set that. But then the other parts are, who is the person to make sure that they get those funds. And so that's really kind of these next roles. So this would traditionally be like an executor, an executrix, the female version of that. So, man or woman who you have named to basically make sure that all of your assets, including assets that have beneficiaries listed on them. So, even a checking account where it was maybe you just listed, they're going to make sure that those funds get split how you wanted them. And that's what your will is for. So the executor is someone you name in your will, and they follow those instructions to make sure that money gets to where it needs to go. They're really kind of the person in charge of doing the paperwork, administering the estate. It might be kind of a formal way of saying that, just the administration of making sure that funds are getting to whom they should go, but doing all of the steps along the way to make sure that happens. So that's an executor. The trustee is very similar, except this is for a person who has a trust that has assets in it. And so the trustee could actually be a separate person. So what's important to understand about all these roles is that each person has a different role, a different part to play. Depending on how your finances are set up and how your family is and who's involved and if they're good with money or if they're not good with money or all of those pieces, that's what you start to think through in each of these roles. So these could all be different people, but typically what I see is that the executor, the trustee, these are the same people, same person. So a trustee is the person who's going to manage the investments or the assets that are inside of that trust. And so a trustee could be different than an executor because the trustee is just managing what's named in the trust. For example, if you had another account that was not named in the trust and your will doesn't say that it should go in there when you pass away, then that executor would manage that differently than the trustee would manage the trust. So that's where they can be different. Typically, in a very common scenario, your executor, your trustee are the same person so that they can handle everything that needs to get done. They're distributing funds to the beneficiaries. And so typically they all work together. Being the same person, that makes that easier. But there are times where you would want to have different people in situations. Maybe it, is you have a lot of financial assets and there are different things going to different people, and you're very specific on how and who you want to inherit money and when. Then you might say, okay, I want the trustee to be different because this is going to be a longer period of time. There could be situations where they could be different, but typically they're the same.
Yeah. I mean, if you have somebody that you trust who's good with money, why not use them for everything?
Yeah, exactly. That's why it does also just make it easier because if you think about the paperwork for a trust account and then the paperwork for just a brokerage account that has your name on it, do you really want to have to get two people to come together to sign the same forms just for different accounts? So it's when you think about kind of the administration and just the day-to-day of what's going to need done, that's why it just makes sense to have the same person, especially if you trust them. So you're exactly right. Yeah. So those are kind of the two roles that are the people making sure that money gets where it needs to go to those beneficiaries. The other role that someone can serve and that you need to name in your will is a guardian. So this is, again, can be an easily forgotten thing. So in your will, you say, if I have minor children, then I need someone to take care of them. So if something happens to you and your spouse and, you need to name someone that would actually be their parents for them, be their guardians. And so, these are hard things for people to think about. And I think sometimes that's kind of what, gets people stuck on not completing these documents because we don't want to think about these things. We don't want to think about, well, when I'm not here, but it is really important. And the hope is that you create these documents and, they don't get used while your kids are young. They're used for years down the road. But in a will, if you have minor children, you would name a guardian. And typically that can be an individual or a couple who's going to care for the kids. Usually we would just want to name one person. So for example, if it's my family, I might list, my sibling, knowing that, my sibling and their spouse are going to take care of our child. But you would kind of name it that way just so there's no confusion or anything like that. So typically it can be written like that. But yeah, that's what the role of the guardian is. Again, when you think about who's going to do what, it's really important. So think through if, let's say you have the guardian named as one person, and then you have your executor and trustee as another person. The executor and the trustee are essentially going to handle the financial piece, the money side of all of this, of where does money get distributed to. If your guardian is a different person yet, imagine that guardian saying, I want to sign them up for summer camp, or I want to sign them up for swim team, but I need money to do that. Now I need to go talk to the executor and the trustee to get the money. Well, what if the executor or the trustee don't agree that you should have the money and that they should be signed up for this? This is what you need to think through is how is this actually going to play out in real life when something needs to happen? And again, that can all function. There are reasons why you would name different people. It's just, think about the frequency of which you have to pay for something for your kids and how many times that person is going to have to talk with them or coordinate a strategy. And again, it can all be done. And there are reasons why you might want to split that to kind of protect that money, make sure that it's being used, kind of give accountability. But just really think through that. If these are people you trust with your kids' lives and parenting them, that's just something I guess I just would question if they're different. But I can definitely see situations where they might be. So that's just kind of the day-to-day thought process of when you set people up, who you're naming, think through it a little bit like that. If you're naming different people, just have, know why. But yeah, so those are the different roles that kind of the main roles that people play in the estate planning process.
Yeah. So that's great. And my next question would be, when do attorneys and the courts get involved with these situations?
Yep. That's a really great question. So when you need to set up all of these documents, you do want an attorney to draft them for you. You specifically would, ideally, it's best to have an attorney in your state that's going to draft these for you. So you want to make sure if you live in Illinois that you're having an Illinois attorney or someone who does practices Illinois law actually create those documents for you. So that's really important. There are online services you can use. We sometimes will say, you get what you pay for, but you're choosing. So you're choosing, what you want to set up, but people do use those because maybe they're more cost effective. We encourage people to use an attorney in their state because that attorney knows the laws of the state and they do change. And you want to make sure that if any of these documents are ever contested, that they're actually be able to stand up in court. So whatever you're having drafted, written for you, that the intent of that would be held up. And so if there's ever a question and they aren't written correctly, then that could jeopardize that. So that's the reason that it's really important. So attorney, when you need to get those documents set up, and then when you pass away or a loved one passes away, an attorney can be helpful. So again, if you have to go through the probate process, so this is someone who hasn't done documents, they don't have things in place, an attorney would need to be involved to basically set up a court date to go through that probate process for the state to say, yep, this is how these assets should go. So they're kind of guiding through that. Attorneys can also be helpful, though, even just in a normal estate. So someone passes away, an attorney is really helpful just as a guide to say, yes, you're doing things correctly. So to an executor, to a trustee, someone who's saying, I have to act and I'm trying to follow what the trust or the will says to do, I think it's really helpful. Sometimes, we will say, let's make sure that the attorney agrees. So that legal opinion of making sure that you're doing things the way they should or the way it's written, that's really helpful too. So attorneys kind of in all of these steps can be helpful just in different ways. The court is basically if something needs filed. So if you needed to go through probate, if there's not a guardian that's listed, one would need to be appointed. So this is basically if you haven't done the work, then you're kind of leaving it to someone else to decide this. And it needs to legally be stated that, yes, these are the people that are to act. And so that is the court's role to decide those things. So
that's a lot of detail. And so it's important for people to know just how many roles there are and how many options there are.
And I think what's helpful just for people to remember is you're setting these documents in place so that someone can follow them. So you want them to be sure, you want to be sure that they can be read easily, that someone can understand them and they know what to do. And that's really your intent in doing this, is you're just trying to make sure that what you want gets done. So yeah.
100%. So now that we have a better understanding of the roles that are involved with inheritance process, let's talk about when they come into play and what they do. So when someone passes, can you just walk us through a timeline of what happens to their money?
Yeah. So kind of just a very high level overview is, if someone passes away, we basically need to do the paperwork to whether there are documents in place or not. So whether you have done the estate planning process or not, we basically need to do paperwork to legally move the money from your name to someone else's name to the beneficiaries, or to get them to the accounts and to the people they need to go. So it's very high level. You're moving money from your name to the people it needs to go. There's a lot of steps. So we're going to kind of break down a lot of these details within that. That first step, kind of that first phase is really, I call it kind of administrative and organization, because you're really trying to find out like what are all the accounts and where should they go? And so the steps in order to do that, right away, it's kind of timely paying the bills. So for example, just end of life expenses, burial, maybe there's real estate a house that needs to be sold. But first it needs to be cleaned out. And so we need, maybe that involves a storage units, or maybe that's, dumpsters to get rid of things. It could be any type of things. And then even just your time. So maybe it's you and your siblings that are going to clean something out. It's just the time involved to do that. But I think right away, those are can be some of the first things, but those bills right away, getting death certificates, you'll need copies of those. And these are typical things that, like a funeral home would help you do. So a lot of these pieces, you kind of do some of these first pieces because you will need them later. So for example, you need those death certificates for the paperwork that you're going to do to move the money from your name to someone else's name. So it's interesting because some of these, you need them for later. So it kind of follows a progression. At the same time, every financial institution can be different. And so one might want and accept a notary, for example, of a signature. Others might want a signature guarantee. And so every institution's different and what they require in order to get the money from your name to the other. That's really where the process can differ. So one of the things is it can be overwhelming. So the person that you're choosing, you want to make sure that they can handle paperwork, that that they're kind of organized, that they know when something comes in the mail, whether they need to take care of it or not, that kind of thing. But it is just that first step of, we kind of like to get everything organized to say, what are the accounts we need to handle? And then from there, we know, okay, is this something that we can just send money to beneficiaries for, or are there different types of accounts and we need to actually talk with them? So it's kind of organizing that so you know what needs to be done. Then from there, you can start to figure out and start working with each of the financial institutions to actually get their paperwork they're going to need. So then you kind of say, okay, for this one, we need this. For this organization, we need this. And so then you can start to complete them just one by one. And it just takes time following their process. Sometimes you'll need to get beneficiaries to sign. Sometimes the executor or the trustee can sign. So when you set up your plan, if you set it up well, you are actually going to make this process much smoother. So this is kind of the process where you, in setting up your plan, are making this faster, smoother, easier for your executor and trustee. So by you setting it up, you're making this go really smooth and easy. And we are working now on a few that are just very messy. And life happens. Sometimes, people pass away before, we never know what tomorrow is going to bring. And so sometimes that just happens. And so it's just, you kind of start with what organize, start to get things done. And so this is why we kind of say, get these set up now, even before you think you need them, because you don't know what it's going to bring. But in doing that, you're making this process easier. So just kind of a reminder there. But then you kind of start to go through, finish all of that paperwork. If there was an estate that needed to be set up, there's probate court hearings along the way too. So for the most part, as you're working through all of that, there is a timeline. It kind of gets laid out naturally. But there are times where, again, if we don't do that organization piece first of saying, here's all the accounts, sometimes there will be an account later that comes up and then we forgot about or we didn't know existed. And then, okay, we need to reopen probate to get that account in here. So again, we have to go back to the court, reopen it to then get it in. So some of these, it just extends the time if we don't have a good list of accounts and things like that. So again, even when you're managing your finances, having a good list of the accounts and someone who knows where they all are and that they exist is actually really important too. So that's kind of that first administrative bucket. And that can take months. It can take years. It really depends how complex things are. There's you could have a really large inheritance. You could have a lot of assets left at the end of your life. And it actually takes a month to get done because everything was set up well. The accounts were titled how they needed to be. You had the documents in order. And you could also have a really tiny one that, is maybe, let's say, a couple $100,000 that could take a year because the accounts weren't set up well. There weren't beneficiaries listed, and we had to go through the process from the employer's 401k. And we couldn't, in some of these, you actually couldn't decide to take it out the way you wanted to because of how you didn't have things set up. So it's not necessarily that the bigger, the more assets you have, that the harder or more complex it's going to be. That's not true. It's really what work have you done in the beginning to set things up so that it goes smooth, whatever the size of the accounts.
No, yeah, that's a great distinction. And I know you talk a lot about this is why having those documents in place is so important and why it's so important to overcome the fear of estate planning.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Fear can really stop a lot of people. So it's interesting. It's interesting, we'll meet with young people who already have documents in place, or they know it's on their list. Oh, I know I need to get this done. And then we'll meet with older clients who may be nearing retirement, and they'll say the same things. I know I need to get this done. It's on the list. But that's a gap of like 20 to 30 years where something didn't get done. And thankfully, you didn't need those documents. But what's really interesting is sometimes the reason for things not getting done, documents not getting placed, there's usually something there. It can be emotional. So for example, people just might have fear. And I know people who have kind of said, like, oh, once I get these documents in place, I'm probably going to die. There is this fear of, it feels final. It feels, like I'm deciding something. And it's hard too, because even as young parents, when you're deciding who's going to take care of my kids, if I'm not alive, that's not a thought that you want to have either. And so I completely understand all of the emotions of these decisions. And I think that, again, is just a reminder of nobody knows what tomorrow will bring. Because of that, we want to be prepared and we want to do what we can. But at the same time, it doesn't mean the worst either. And so we don't want fear of what could happen. We don't want that to stop us from doing what we can do. And really, if we do it, it's going to be much better than if we don't. So just, some of these, it can really stop us, that fear, but we should instead kind of fear the mess that we're leaving people if we don't set things up. That is more now, watching people go through that. It can really affect relationships and, what people have to deal with, the decisions that have to get made. If you don't set that up, I think that's probably a bigger thing to be afraid of. And because we want, even when we pass away and when we aren't here, we would love for those strong relationships that our family has to continue. And so you are actually helping that continue in what you do or don't do. So yeah, I would just encourage people, think about it, maybe a little bit different way. If you're one of those that says, well, but once I do, it feels so final. I totally understand, but it's okay. We're actually helping them. And it doesn't mean that it's final. So
yeah. And I would almost say like, that's part of the responsibility of having money, of having kids. You should have a plan if something goes wrong. That way you're still taking care of your money. You're still taking care of your kids, even if you're not there.
Yeah. That's such a great reminder. I actually heard someone recently use that word, responsibility, kind of this weight, this responsibility of, I feel this responsibility of making this decision or handling this well. And I really thought about that to think like, what is, even the definition of the word responsibility. Anytime I hear words, I just love looking up the definition because I think we can just like change what it means. So when you go back to what it really says, I just love that. So just the reminders, like responsibility is the state or fact of having a duty to deal with something or having control over someone. So it is kind of like this duty. It is something that you need to deal with. So it is a responsibility kind of in describing that inheritance because it's something that you're receiving. So I do think that word is actually pretty accurate. When I was talking with that person, it was just funny because if you just imagine in your head, if I were to inherit, you choose the amount. If you were to inherit any money, what probably goes through your head? And so I know I can answer that for myself. I could say, oh, I would be excited to get money, like I think. Now, what's interesting is not everybody would have that same thought, but I think in my head, well, people would be excited, but that's not true for everybody. Like, I don't know what you think of, Anna, when you think of that.
When I think about inheriting money, it depends 100% on who I'm inheriting money from. So like, maybe I'm really excited, but then I might feel a little bit guilty because I'm like, oh my goodness, this person just died and I'm excited to use their money. Like, should I be excited that I now have all these opportunities? So I think there can also be like guilt and shame and kind of confusion of how can I be excited that this person is gone and I get to use their money now for my plan, So there's a lot that goes on there.
Yes. And I think that's the piece where the thought of it ahead of time versus the reality of it in the moment. When you think about inheriting something from someone, the first thought is not usually, well, they're not going to be here. I'm just inheriting this from this. I'm going to get money from them. But in reality, that person is no longer here. And now you are hearing, oh, you've inherited money from them. Okay, well, that feels different. And so I think when you're in the moment of the reality of it versus just thinking about what I'll do when it happens, it's very different because there's emotions that are real, they're facts, they're, and so what you're dealing with during those times are different. So yeah, so I honestly can't stress enough, though, for people how valuable your actions are before you pass away. I also just want everyone to know that there is help out there to walk you and your loved ones through all of these steps that we're talking about, the administration of and the organization of this. We get on the phone with clients, and I'm not just saying this like for us, but knowing that there are advisors who will walk through this with you, to call, to help you have the answer when you don't know the answer or wouldn't know it. So you're not left alone by yourself to answer these questions. Mm-hmm. Someone's going to help you. When that form comes that you need to fill out from that financial institution and it looks different than the other financial institution you needed to fill out, there's someone that's going to help you and make sure that things are set up in the right order that they need to be for the funds to be received when they come from there. So I just want people to know, that when you're going through the emotions of this, and this, is hard to deal with in the moment, that there's also people to help you. And we love walking through this with clients just so that they know and they aren't carrying the weight by themselves. So I think that's one of the biggest pieces that we love, is that we just know that we're helping clients and that they don't feel the burden of this. And, we can easily say, well, we'll do that for you. Let's get on a call together. And I think that just helps to kind of ease it so you're not by yourself.
Yeah, for sure. Because like we said, it is a responsibility, but it's not a responsibility that you have to carry on your own.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of phase one, the paperwork, the administrative side of the inheritance process. Mm-hmm. So what happens in phase two? What's next?
Yeah. So phase two, once you've done all this paperwork, once everything's organized, you're kind of really starting to make everything happen. So phase two is really figuring out, okay, now that things are in accounts that I can distribute from, now we're kind of figuring out how much goes to who were those beneficiaries, what percentage were they supposed to get, who handles the transfers, you can, the executor, the trustee, are the people that are actually going to make that happen. So again, the beneficiaries aren't doing that work. They're kind of just doing the work of receiving. And then even the tax implications of these pieces. So this is kind of a very big picture. The second phase is how much goes to who, making sure that it goes to them. What are the tax implications when it goes to them so that they can actually then make good decisions. So one of the neat things that can happen in this stage is, let's say that you have an IRA, let's say that you have just a brokerage account. There's different tax implications to the beneficiary, depending on how they receive these funds. And so one of the neat things is this is where you can work with beneficiaries. So how I said, like, beneficiaries don't get to decide these things. They're not the ones doing the work and the paperwork, but they can be a part of the process to decide, well, what's best for them. So one of the nice things is that because of the Secure Act for inherited IRAs, qualified accounts, it is actually and can be really important that the beneficiary's financial situation is taken into account when you're figuring out how should those funds be received. Should I just get a check for these? So these are common questions we'll hear. Should I just get a check for these funds? Should I just deposit it into my checking account when I do? Should I put this into my own IRA? These are the questions now as a beneficiary you start to have. And it could be because the executor and the trustee is asking you, like they're asking you, how would you like to receive them? So this is really common. So this is when the beneficiary starts to get involved because they're getting questions asked of them, because it will impact their taxes. And what that ultimately impacts is the money that you receive, how much you receive, how much you keep. So if you're choosing what's best for you, and that also works for the estate or the trust, then it's a win-win for everybody. So that's why it is important. But that's kind of in this step where you start to ask the beneficiary some of these questions too. When we kind of break some of these two pieces down, if we say an IRA, for example, so a beneficiary now might be asked, okay, there's an IRA, you're a 50% beneficiary, so you're going to get half of the money in here. Let's say that's $50,000. The reason that this becomes important for the beneficiary now is because you could receive that $50,000. And let's say that you just told them, you didn't think about it. You just said, you are someone who's like, I'm just receiving $50,000. That's exciting in the sense that, there was something left over that they wanted me to have. Okay, I'm getting $50,000. I get a check for it. I put it in my checking account. Great. But that $50,000 now is taxable as a $50,000 paycheck that you just received. So when you do your tax return, you're going to have $50,000 more of income on your tax return that you need to pay taxes for. And again, that might be fine. So this is where you just have to decide. But the other option that you have is that you could say, okay, instead of just receiving a check, I'm going to open an inherited IRA account and I'm going to put these funds in it. Now I might have a period of up to 10 years where I can take this money out. So instead of getting $50,000 all at once, I might say, okay, over the next 10 years, I'm going to take out $5,000. And so now I'm only taxed at the $5,000 each year for my income, in addition to whatever income I already have. But let's say that someone who's in the low tax bracket, that $5,000 could mean that you're actually not going to pay any taxes on that because you're in a low bracket. But if you took the 50 at once, you might have to pay, let's say, 12% in taxes on that. That's a big difference to how much you ultimately keep. So this is where you start and you want to think through, what is my situation versus, and now how should I take the money versus, just a quick decision of, well, how should I get these funds? So that's kind of that process of really thinking through. That's where, executors and trustees really do the beneficiaries a big favor, and they really kind of honor them when they ask them these questions and when they say, how would you like to receive this? And so it's really helpful, again, when you're choosing these people, it's really helpful that you can actually make sure these are people who, again, it's even a bonus if they can work together. They know each other. A lot of times these are probably family members. And so it's really good when you know that their relationships are strong so they can decide these things well.
Yeah. What are other tax factors that people should keep in mind, whether they're the executor, trustee, or beneficiary?
Yeah. So there is another big one. So for example, let's just say that there's maybe a larger, financial situation where people have trusts that are involved, and maybe there's multiple trusts. And the trust, for example, might say that these funds should be distributed, in the next 5 years, all of them should be distributed. Or it might say next year, distribute 10%, the following year, 20%, the following year, 30%, you kind of break it out. So that's where a trust is great because you can decide if you think that that's helpful. If you know the beneficiaries you're naming of your trust and you think it would be better for them to inherit things over time rather than all at once, that's typically why a lot of people do that. Because they might, if you know the size of your assets, then you're kind of calculating in your mind, okay, this is how much this is going to be. So that can be one. So trusts are a big one. When this is one where planning is really helpful. So for example, a trust, if assets are in a trust, trusts have a different tax bracket. So very quickly it gets to a 40% tax bracket, where anything, income, gains are taxed at 40%. Personally, it takes a very high income to get to tax brackets that are in that even realm. And so that's where if you're someone who's in a high tax bracket already, you might be thinking, well, I'm already, whether I receive this personally or whether it stays in the trust, it doesn't matter. But someone who isn't in a high tax bracket, and if we pass those funds on to, so let's just say there's $25,000 of gains or income from that trust that year. Well, if we can distribute those to the beneficiaries, we can pass that on out of the trust. Now it's going to be taxed at the beneficiary's lower tax rate. So this is where even just being aware of the different tax brackets for beneficiaries versus the trust, again, what we're doing is we are keeping as much of the money as possible. We're still paying tax on it. We're still using the structure that's in place. We're just saying, how can we pay as little as possible so that the beneficiaries get as much as possible? Because I think, honestly, all of us would be more excited, even if there was a difference of $5,000 in taxes between one option and another. I think all of us would be excited, even if we said, well, I would give that $5,000 to a charitable organization. We could decide what to do with it rather than being forced to pay more in taxes than we might have otherwise been able to. So that's another big situation where, whether it's a brokerage account, whether it's titled in a trust, whether it's an IRA or a qualified account like a 401k, all of these have different ways and different rules for how money is taxed and how it gets passed on. This is where back to kind of that organization stage, this is where you really want to go through all of that first. You really kind of get all the information. Now, I think sometimes for people, they kind of think, well, why do you need to know all this information? As I've just explained, this is why. Because if you give all the information, if you tell someone who can actually help you plan these out, if you give that information to a financial planner who can help you and who can lay all of this out to figure out and make those decisions, now you're helping everybody. If you only tell them half of the information, and a lot of times I don't know that people, they don't do this to be mean, but I think sometimes people will kind of tell, maybe their financial advisor, it depends, but sometimes I think they'll kind of, maybe say these are most of my assets, but then I have this one account over here that is kind of my play account. I think sometimes people can kind of leave accounts like that out there, and they might be small. They might have a few shares here or there, but it's really important because those things can make a huge difference in the overall plan of everything. So again, knowing everything and just all of the pieces involved really helps you to accomplish and get the best outcome versus if you kind of leave one account here, one there. So it's really, kind of keeping everything in order, organized, but also making sure, okay, everything is planned for, everything's accounted for, so that then it can be administered the best way for everybody.
Yeah. Are there any other inheritance tax considerations that people should have in mind as they're inheriting or as they're structuring their estate plans?
Yeah. Yep. So I think a lot of these are really, they're really like, there's gift tax, for example. There can be, usually when you inherit funds from someone, if you're the beneficiary, you don't typically, if you just inherit something, you don't typically pay tax on that. You just inherit that. So life insurance, for example, you just receive those funds. You don't pay tax on that. The ones where you do pay tax, the accounts where you do pay tax are those retirement accounts where there are tax implications when money comes out. The trust, things like that, like I've already described. But if it's life insurance, things like that, where you just receive a lump sum, those you just inherit tax-free. So there are this is where it's understanding kind of everything you're inheriting and what types of accounts and things, because it determines how it applies to you. But those are really most of the types of taxes.
And that's a great lead into the final phase 3. What happens now that the money is in your bank account? What do you do with it?
Yeah. So I think this is one of the interesting things is I watch people go through the process of inheriting assets. There really is this kind of progression of emotions that people will have. And we kind of talked a little bit about this from, you move from the stage of, oh, someday I might inherit funds. And, it's kind of just this thought. And we don't really have like the reality of it in our mind. And then there's the reality of I'm inheriting funds because my loved one isn't here anymore. And so then you have the emotion of that. You go through this administration phase, this distribution phase, and now it's, okay, now these funds are in my account, like you're saying. And so now it's, what do I do? What I can see, at different times, some people get very sentimental. And so they'll, for example, someone who, it was very common for people to work at one company. And, if 40 years ago they started working at a company and they got their employer stock, I think people are very loyal to their employer and they would buy their company stock and those dividends would just keep reinvesting or they would just live off the dividends. It's very common that people would have a lot of their company stock. And so it's a very concentrated position. People, sometimes beneficiaries will think, well, they did that. I kind of think that I might want to do that too. And what I always encourage people with is once the sentimental kind of thought, and I completely understand that. And I think there is a place for that. And there's ways that you can work around it. So what I always tell people is when you're inheriting funds from your loved one, you have to remember that you inheriting funds was part of their plan. That now that you've inherited something, they have accomplished a goal from their financial plan. They wanted you to inherit something. And we don't always know how much that's going to be, but they wanted you to inherit something. And so now one of the goals of their plan has actually been accomplished. They had enough money to live on for their needs while they were alive. And so there's extra now to pass on to you. And so that was something that they've achieved. And that's exciting. And I think something good to remember. And so now it's coming into my plan. And so now how do I need to think about it for my plan? And so now you have to think about it as, well, what does my plan look like?
Mm-hmm.
Am I on track? And do I need to fund something a little bit more? Do I have, something I need to pay off? Like, you have to start thinking about it now as, okay, now it's in my plan. And so there is kind of this, not that you have to disconnect and say, okay, I can't be sentimental about what they owned. But now the reality of you thinking, well, that company that they worked at for 40 years, that was such a great investment, it might not be that good of an investment for you for the next 40 years. And so this is where you have to start to think. But it doesn't mean that we can't own some of it. We can't hold some of it to kind of honor, them. And so this is where we kind of start to have some of these conversations, because I think it is fun and it's meaningful. And we don't just want to rush people through that emotional process of, okay, now the money's yours and you need to stop thinking like that. Mm-hmm. That's not at all, what you should or have to do. And so now it's just, okay, let's just realize that, hey, let's celebrate that they're accomplishing something in their goal, in their plan, a goal. And now it's in your plan. So now how do we start to think about it?
Yeah, it's almost like their goal was to fund your goals.
Mm-hmm.
So you should accept that, and you should take that money and use it for your plan and not try to live off of their plan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting too. I've also heard some people say, well, when I was alive, mom and dad would give us money to actually go on a vacation together. So I actually know that was important to them too. I think some of those things can just remind us that we don't have to feel guilty or shameful when we receive something, because they actually enjoyed doing those things during their life. And so they kind of had this balance of, we want to live more and give more, kind of, things that we encourage people to do. And so just that balance of, yes, we're being wise with it, but we're also being thoughtful and enjoying life too with our loved ones, especially if that was something that they really valued. So I think those are just good reminders that I've heard from people, and as they've worked through these processes. So I just love hearing those thoughts, because I think sometimes it helps other people think through this as they're going through the process.
Yeah. And this final phase is actually something that we're going to dive into in our next episode. Our next episode is going to cover a lot more of the emotional and how should you think about receiving an inheritance and the responsibility of that. But for now, is there anything else that people should think about as they're in the inheritance process, whether they're structuring that or whether they're receiving one?
Yeah. A few good reminders I would just say for people is being encouraged that you getting your own documents in place is always a good thing, whether they're needed soon, whether they're going to be needed years down the road. You can always make changes. So it's always an encouragement for people to get things in order, because you're helping everyone by doing that. And then also, if you are inheriting funds and you just feel like you're on your own and you need help doing that, just knowing there are people who can walk you through the process and really kind of take that burden off of your shoulders. This is just something we love to do for people. We walk through a lot of people in this process, and we've seen people who, right after there was nothing in place and they had planned to get things in place, but everything is very complex. There's a lot of LLCs that held real estate, or there's, different types of investments than kind of traditional investments, and things can be very complex. And there's not one spreadsheet that tracked everything. This is where someone else can step in and actually help you take care of all of these details and create that spreadsheet for you and do that heavy lifting of all the paperwork and the administration and the organization to then plan for the best way to handle it. There are people, we help clients with this. There are people that want to help you with this, and they can help you do it well, so that you can manage a lot of the other things, like going through the belongings, going through some of these harder, more emotional things. So just realize you're You're not alone. There's people that can help you. So I just always love to encourage people. And so I would just say those are my encouragements, whether, wherever you find yourself in whatever steps of these, there's people that want to help you and can help you to really lift the burden of this so that you can manage that responsibility really well and kind of feel like you're managing it with wisdom and kind of discerning really well what to do.
Yeah, for sure. We know that thinking about structuring or receiving an inheritance can be daunting for more than one reason, for the complexity, for the emotions involved. So we're going to link all of those in the show notes. Feel free to check those out. If you enjoyed this episode, why don't you share it with somebody who you think could find it valuable? So tune in 2 weeks for our next episode where we're going to dive deeper into that phase 3. We'll talk to you then.
Thanks for listening. To find any links or resources related to this episode, check out our show notes. Your host was Michelle Smallenberger, a certified financial planner and CEO. The guests featured are from Financial Design Studio, a team of experienced fiduciary, fee-only advisors based in Chicago. Anna Lewis is the executive producer of the Behind the Designs podcast. And as always, for more information about Financial Design Studio and who we are, check out our website, financialdesignstudio.com. And final note, no content discussed on this podcast should be taken as financial advice. Financial Design Studio accepts no responsibility for your individual choices. We'll see you in the next episode.